the power and mission of Michael, necessity of the revaluation of many values. In this course of lectures, I should like to describe the relationship which we, human beings of the present day, may gain to that spiritual power which, as the power of Michael, intervenes in the spiritual and physical events of the earth. It will be necessary to prepare ourselves in today's lecture for this task. We shall need various points of view which will enable human intelligence really to present the various interferences with a just designated power on the background of the symptoms which we may observe in our surroundings. Let me try and read that sentence again. We shall need various points of view which will enable human intelligence really to present the various interferences with the just designated power on the background of the symptoms which we may observe in our surroundings. We must keep in mind, if we wish to speak seriously of the spiritual world, that we always may look upon the manifestations of the spiritual powers here in the physical world. We try to penetrate, as it were, through the veil of the physical world to that which is active in the spiritual world. What exists in the physical world may be observed by everyone. What is active in the spiritual world serves to solve the riddles posed by the physical world. But we must sense the riddles of physical life in the right way. It is important, in connection with these weighty matters, to comprehend in full seriousness anthroposophy differentiates between body, soul, and spirit, and thus teaches a heresy opposed to the orthodox belief that man consists of body and soul. I have mentioned to you before that modern philosophers have adopted this differentiation of body and soul without being aware of it. They believe that they carry on unbiased objective science. They believe they practice real observation, which leads them to the conviction that man consists of body and soul. In truth, however, they are following in the footsteps of this dogma which has found its way into modern spiritual development. What is considered science today is actually completely dependent on such things as have been put into the world in the course of modern human evolution. Do not believe that you will be able, with kind words, to convert such people who from these quarters slander anthroposophy. Do not believe that you will prevail upon them and call forth their goodwill toward anthroposophy. Anthroposophy must make its way in the world through its own force, and not through the protection of any power, be it ever so Christian in appearance. Through inner strength alone can anthroposophy achieve what it must achieve in the world. You must realize that the Christ impulse can only be comprehended if one sees in it the impulse of equilibrium between the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic principles, if one gives it the right place within the Trinity. We may ask, what must one do if one tries to deceive people in regard to the true Christ impulse? One must divert their attention from the true threefold ordering of the world and direct it toward the delusion of the duad, which is justified only when we are concerned with the manifest, and not when we are concerned with what lies behind the manifest in the sphere of truth. In such matters we must go beyond mere names. Calling some being or other Christ does not mean that it is the Christ. If one wishes to prevent another human being from acquiring a true concept of the Christ, one need only put the duad in the place of the triad. But if one wishes to point to the Christ impulse in its true meaning, it is necessary that the duad be supplanted by the triad. We need not join the group of people who declare others to be heretics. We need not declare Milton's Paradise Lost and Klopstock's Messiah to be damnable works of the devil. We may continue to enjoy their beauty and grandeur, but we must realize that such works, inasmuch as they are the blossoms of popular modern civilization, do not speak of Christ at all, but originate from the delusion that everything that is not part of human evolution may be considered as belonging, on the one hand, to the realm of the devil, and on the other, to the realm of the divine. But in reality, instead of dealing with the realm of the divine, we are dealing with the realm of Lucifer. Paradise Lost describes the expulsion of man from Lucifer's realm into the realm of Ahriman. It describes the longing of man not for the realm of the divine, but for the paradise that has been lost. That means the longing for the realm of Lucifer. You may regard Milton's Paradise Lost and Klopstock's Messiah as beautiful descriptions of human longing for the realm of Lucifer. This is what you should consider them to be, for this is what they are. You see how necessary it is to revise certain conceptions which prevail today. If we are serious in our anthroposophical thinking and feeling, we are faced not with insignificant, but with important decisions. We are faced with the necessity of taking very seriously an expression which Nietzsche has often employed, namely the expression, the revaluation of values. We have to take this very seriously. The achievements of modern man are in great need of revaluation. This does not mean that we ourselves have to become denouncers of heresy. We constantly perform here scenes from Goethe's Faust, and I have, as you know, devoted decades of my life to the study of Goethe. But from my little book, titled Goethe's Standard of the Soul, you can see that this has not blinded me to the false characterization drawn by Goethe in his Mephistopheles. It would be a Philistine standpoint were we to say, Goethe's Mephistopheles is a false conception, let's get rid of him. We should then be behaving like inquisitors. As modern men, we must not place ourselves in such a position. On the other hand, we must not be indolently satisfied with the ideas that have entered, as it were, into the flesh and bones of the great masses of people today. Mankind will have to learn a great deal. It will have to transvalue many values. All this is connected with the mission of Michael in relation to those beings of the higher hierarchies with whom he is connected. At the beginning of our own era, the Incarnation of Christ took place. And to begin with, the significance of the Incarnation of Christ was grasped because the power of the old Lucifer incarnation still survived. This power did not actually fade from man's faculty of comprehension until the 4th century A.D., and even then it had its aftermath, its ramifications. To these two incarnations, the Lucifer incarnation in ancient times and the incarnation of Christ which gives the earth its meaning, a third incarnation will be added in a future not so very far distant. And the events of the present time are already moving in such a way as to prepare for it. Of the incarnation of Lucifer at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, we must say, through Lucifer, man has acquired the faculty of using the organs of his intellect, of his power of intellectual discernment. It was Lucifer himself in a human body who was the first to grasp through the power of intellect what formerly could be imparted to man only through revelation, namely the content of the mysteries. What is now in preparation and will quite definitely come to pass on earth in a none too distant future is an actual incarnation of Ahriman. As you know, since the middle of the 15th century, we have been living in an era in which it behooves mankind to come more and more into possession of the full power of consciousness. It is of the very greatest importance that men should approach the coming incarnation of Ahriman with full consciousness of this event. The incarnation of Lucifer could be recognized only by the prophetic insight of the priests of the mysteries. Men were also very unconscious of what the incarnation of Christ and the event of Golgotha really signified. But they must live on toward the incarnation of Ahriman with full consciousness amid the shattering events which will occur on the physical plane. Amid the perpetual stresses of war and other tribulations of the immediate future, the human mind will become very inventive in the domain of physical life. And through this very growth of inventiveness in physical life, which cannot be averted in any way or by any means, the bodily existence of a human individuality in whom Ahriman can incarnate will become possible and inevitable. From the spiritual world, this Ahrimanic power is preparing for incarnation on the earth. He is endeavoring in every conceivable way to make such preparation that the incarnation of Ahriman in human form may be able to mislead and corrupt mankind on earth to the uttermost. A task of mankind during the next phase of civilization will be to live toward the incarnation of Ahriman with such alert consciousness that this incarnation can actually serve to promote a higher spiritual development, inasmuch as through Ahriman himself man will become aware of what can, or shall we say, cannot be achieved by physical life alone. But men must go forward with full consciousness toward this incarnation of Ahriman and become more and more alert in every domain, in order to recognize with greater and greater clarity those trends in life which are leading toward this Ahrimanic incarnation. Men must learn from spiritual science to find the key to life, and so be able to recognize and learn to control the currents leading toward the incarnation of Ahriman. It must be realized that Ahriman will live among men on the earth, but that in confronting him, men will themselves determine what they may learn from him, what they may receive from him. This, however, they will not be able to do unless from now onward they take control of certain spiritual and also unspiritual currents which otherwise are used by Ahriman for the purpose of leaving mankind as deeply unconscious as possible of his coming. Then, one day, he will be able to appear on earth and overwhelm men, tempting and luring them to repudiate earth evolution, thus preventing it from reaching its goal. To understand the whole process of which I have been speaking, it is essential to recognize the character of certain currents and influences, spiritual or the reverse. Do you not see the continually growing number of people at the present time who do not want any science of the Spirit, any knowledge of the spiritual? Do you not see how numerous are the people to whom the old forces of religion no longer give any inner stimulus? Whether they go to church or not is a matter of complete indifference to large numbers of human beings nowadays. The old religious impulses mean nothing to them, but neither will they bring themselves to give a thought to what can stream into our civilization as new spiritual life. They resist it, reject it, regard it as folly, as something inconvenient. They will not allow themselves to have anything to do with it. But you see, man as he lives on earth is veritably a unity. His spiritual nature cannot be separated from his physical nature. Both work together as a unity between birth and death. And even if man does not receive the spiritual through his faculties of soul, the spiritual takes effect nevertheless. Since the last third of the 19th century, the spiritual has been streaming around us. It is streaming into earthly evolution. The spiritual is there in very truth. Only men are not willing to receive it. But even if they do not accept the spiritual, it is there. And what becomes of it? Paradoxical as it may seem, for much that is true seems paradoxical to the modern mind, in those people who refuse the spiritual and like eating and drinking best of all things, best again, in those people who refuse the spiritual and like eating and drinking best of all things in life, the spiritual streams unconsciously to them into the processes of eating and digestion. This is the secret of that march into materialism, which began about the year 1840, or rather was then in active preparation. Those who do not receive the spiritual through their souls receive it today nonetheless. In eating and drinking, they eat and drink the spirit. They are eaters of the soul and spirit. And in this way, the spirit that is streaming into earth evolution passes over into the Luciferic element, is conveyed to Lucifer. Thereby the Luciferic power, which can then be of help to the Ahrimanic power for its later incarnation, is constantly strengthened. This must come to the knowledge of those who admit the fact that in the future men will either receive spiritual knowledge consciously or consume the spirit unconsciously, thereby delivering it into the hands of the Luciferic powers. This stream of spirit and soul consumption is particularly encouraged by Ahriman, because in this way he can lull mankind into greater and greater drowsiness, so that then through his incarnation he will be able to come among men and fall upon them unawares, because they do not confront him consciously. But Ahriman can also make direct preparation for his incarnation, and he does so. Certainly, men of our day also have a spiritual life, but it is purely intellectual, unconnected with the spiritual world. This purely intellectual life is becoming more and more widespread. At first it took effect mainly in the sciences, but now it is leading to mischiefs of every kind in social life as well. What is the essential character of this intellectual life? This intellectual life has very little to do with the true interests of men. I ask you, how many teachers do you not see today passing in and out of higher and lower educational institutions without bringing any inner enthusiasm to their science, but pursuing it merely as a means of livelihood? In such cases, the interest of the soul is not directly linked with the actual pursuit. The same thing happens even at school. Think how much is learned at the various stages of life without any real enthusiasm or interest. How external the intellectual life is becoming for many people who devote themselves to it. And how many there are today who are forced to produce a mass of intellectual material which is then preserved in libraries, and as spiritual life is not truly alive. Everything that is developing as intellectual life without being suffused by warmth of soul, without being quickened by enthusiasm, directly furthers the incarnation of Ahriman in a way that is after his own heart. It lulls men to sleep in the way I have described, so that its results are advantageous to Ahriman. There are numerous other currents in the spiritual or unspiritual life which Ahriman can turn to his advantage. You have lately heard, and you are still hearing it, that national states, national empires must be founded. A great deal is said about freedom of the individual peoples. But the time for founding empires based on relationships of blood and race is past and over in the evolution of mankind. If an appeal is made today to national, racial, or similar relationships, to relationships arising out of the intellect and not out of the spirit, then disharmony among mankind will be intensified. And it is this disharmony among mankind which Ahrimanic power can put to special use. Chauvinism, perverted patriotism in every form, this is the material from which Ahriman will build just what he needs. But there are other things as well. Everywhere today we see parties being formed for one object or another. People nowadays have no discernment, nor do they desire to have it where party opinions and party programs are concerned. With intellectual ingenuity, proof can be furnished in support of the most radically opposing theories. Very clever arguments can be used to prove the soundness of Leninism. But the same applies to directly contrary principles, and also to what lies between the two extremes. An excellent case can be made out for every party program, but the one who establishes the validity of the opposite program is equally right. The intellectualism prevailing among men today is not capable of demonstrating the inner potentialities and values of anything. It can furnish proofs, but what is intellectually proved should not be regarded as of real value or efficacy in life. Men oppose one another in parties because the soundness of every party opinion, at any rate the main party opinions, can be proved with equal justification. Our intellect remains at the surface layer of understanding, and does not penetrate to the deeper layer where the truth actually lies. This too must be fundamentally and thoroughly understood. People today prefer to let their intellect remain on the surface, and not to penetrate with deeper forces to those levels where the essential nature of things is disclosed. It is only necessary to look around a little, for even where it takes its most external form, life often reveals the pitfalls of current predilections. People love numbers and figures in science, but they also love figures in the social sphere as well. Social science consists almost entirely of statistics, and from statistics, that is to say from figures, the weightiest conclusions are reached. Well, with figures too, anything can be proved and anything believed, for figures are not a means whereby the essential reality of things can be proved. They are simply a means of deception. Whenever one fails to look beyond figures to the qualitative, they can be utterly deceptive. The following is an obvious example. There is, or at least there used to be, a great deal of argument about the nationality of the Macedonians. In the political life of the Balkan Peninsula, much depended upon the statistics compiled there. The figures are of just as much value as those contained in other statistics. Whether statistics are compiled of wheat and rye production, or of the numbers of Greek, Serbian, or Bulgarian nationals in Macedonia, in regard to what can be proved by these means, it is all the same. From the figures quoted for the Greeks, for the Bulgarians, for the Serbians, very plausible conclusions can be drawn. But one can also have an eye for the qualitative element. And then one often finds it recorded that the father was Greek, one son was Bulgarian, another was Serbian. What is at the back of it, you can puzzle out for yourselves. These statistics are taken as authoritative, whereas in this case they were compiled solely in support of party aims. It stands to reason that if the father is really a Greek, the two sons are also Greeks, but the procedure adopted there is just an example of many other things that are done with figures. Ahriman can achieve a great deal through figures and numbers used in this way as evidence of proof. A further means of which Ahriman can avail himself is again one that will seem paradoxical. As you know, we have been concerned in our movement to study the Gospels in the light of spiritual science. But these deeper interpretations of the Gospels, which are becoming more and more necessary in our time, are rejected on all sides, just as spiritual science as a whole is rejected. The people who often profess humility in these matters, and they are insistent about it, are actually the most arrogant of all. More and more generally it is being said that people should steep themselves in the very simplicity of the Gospels, and not attempt to understand the mystery of Golgotha by entering into the complexities of spiritual science. Those who feign unpretentiousness in their study of the Gospels are the most arrogant of all, for they despise the honest search for knowledge demanded in spiritual science. So arrogant are they that they believe the highest revelations of the spiritual world can be garnered without effort, simply by browsing on the simplicity of the Gospels. What claims to be humble or simple today is often supreme arrogance. In sects, in religious confessions, it is there that the most arrogant of men are to be found. It must be remembered that the Gospels came into existence at a time when the Luciferic wisdom still survived. In the first centuries of Christendom, men's understanding of the Gospels was quite different from what it came to be in later times. Deeper understanding of the Gospels in the light of spiritual science is essential today, for the apathy that takes hold of people who are content to live merely within the arms of the denominations will be used to the utmost by Ahriman in order to achieve his goal, which is that his incarnation shall catch men unawares. And those who believe they are being most truly Christian by rejecting any development of the conception of the Christ mystery are, in their arrogance, the ones who do most to promote Ahriman's aims. The denominations and sects are positively spheres of encouragement, breeding grounds for Ahriman. It is futile to gloss these things over with illusions. Just as the materialistic attitude, rejecting the spiritual altogether, and contending that man is a product of what he eats and drinks, furthers Ahriman's aims, so are these aims furthered by the stubborn rejection of everything spiritual and adherence to the literal, simple conception of the Gospels. You see, a barrier which prevents the single Gospels from unduly circumscribing the human mind has been erected through the fact that the event of Golgotha is described in the Gospels from 4 seemingly contradictory sides. Only a little reflection will show that this is a protection from too literal a conception. In sects, however, where one Gospel only is taken as the basis of the teaching, and such sects are quite numerous, pitfalls, stupefaction, and hallucination are generated. In their day, the Gospels were given as a necessary counterweight to the Luciferic gnosis. But if no attempt is made to develop understanding of their content, the aims of Ahriman are furthered, not the progress of mankind. In the absolute sense, nothing is good in itself, but is always good or bad according to the use to which it is put. The best can be the worst if wrongly used. Sublime though they are, the Gospels can also have the opposite effect if men are too lazy to search for a deeper understanding based on spiritual science. Hence, there is a great deal in the spiritual and unspiritual currents of the present time, of which men should be acutely aware and determine their attitude of soul accordingly. Upon the ability and willingness to penetrate to the roots of such matters will depend the effect which the incarnation of Ahriman can have upon men, whether this incarnation will lead them to prevent the earth from reaching its goal, or bring home to them the very limited significance of intellectual unspiritual life. If men rightly take in hand the currents leading toward Ahriman, then simply through his incarnation in earthly life they will recognize the Ahrimanic influence on the one side, and on the other its polar opposite, the Luciferic influence. And then the very contrast between the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic will enable them to perceive the third reality. Men must consciously wrestle through to an understanding of this trinity of the Christian impulse, the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic influences. For without this consciousness, they will not be able to go forward into the future with the prospect of achieving the goal of earth existence. Spiritual science must be taken in deep earnestness, for only so can it be rightly understood. It is not the outcome of any sectarian whim, but something that has proceeded from the fundamental needs of human evolution. Those who recognize these needs cannot choose between whether they will or will not endeavor to foster spiritual science. On the contrary, they will say to themselves, The whole physical and spiritual life of men must be illumined and pervaded by the conceptions of spiritual science. Just as once in the East there was a Lucifer incarnation, and then at the midpoint, as it were, of world evolution, the incarnation of Christ, so in the West there will be an incarnation of Ahriman. This Ahrimanic incarnation cannot be averted. It is inevitable, for men must confront Ahriman face to face. He will be the individuality by whom it will be made clear to men what indescribable cleverness can be developed if they call to their help all that earthly forces can do to enhance cleverness and ingenuity. In the catastrophes that will befall humanity in the near future, men will become extremely inventive. Many things discovered in the forces and substances of the universe will be used to provide nourishment for man. But these very discoveries will at the same time make it apparent that matter is connected with the organs of intellect, not with the organs of the spirit, but of the intellect. People will learn to eat and drink in order to become really clever. Eating and drinking cannot make them spiritual, but clever and astute, yes. Men have no knowledge of these things as yet, but not only will they be striven for, they will be the inevitable outcome of catastrophes looming in the near future. And certain secret societies, where preparations are already in train, will apply these things in such a way that the necessary conditions can be established for an actual incarnation of Ahriman on the earth. This incarnation cannot be averted, for men must realize during the time of the earth's existence just how much can proceed from purely material processes. He must learn to bring under his control those spiritual or unspiritual currents which are leading to Ahriman. Once it is realized that conflicting party programs can be proved equally correct, our attitude of soul will be that we do not set out to prove things, but rather to experience them. For to experience a thing is a very different matter from attempting to prove it intellectually. Equally, we shall be convinced that deeper and deeper penetration of the Gospels is necessary through spiritual science. The literal, word-for-word acceptance of the Gospels that is still so prevalent today promotes Ahrimanic culture. Even on external grounds, it is obvious that a strictly literal acceptance of the Gospels is unjustified. For as you know, what is good and right for one time is not right for every other time. What is right for one epoch becomes Luciferic or Ahrimanic when practiced in a later one. The mere reading of the Gospel texts has had its day. What is essential now is to acquire a spiritual understanding of the mystery of Golgotha in the light of the truths enshrined in the Gospels. Many people, of course, find these things disquieting, but those whose interest is attracted by anthroposophy must learn to realize that the levels of culture, gradually piling one above the other, have created chaos, and that light must penetrate again into this chaos. It is interesting nowadays to listen to someone whose views have become very extreme, or to read about some burning question of the day, and then to listen to sermons on the same subject given by a priest of some denomination who is still steeped in the form of thought current in bygone times. There you face two worlds which you cannot possibly confuse unless you avoid all attempts to get at the root of these things. Listen to a modern socialist speaking about social questions, and then immediately afterward to a Catholic preacher speaking about the same questions. It is very interesting to find two levels of culture existing side by side, but using the words in an entirely different sense. The same word has quite a different meaning in each case. These things should be seen in the light that will dawn if they are taken in the earnest spirit we have been trying to convey. People belonging to definite religions do also come in the end to long, in their own way, for spiritual deepening. It is by no means without significance that a man as eminently spiritual as Cardinal Neumann, ardent Catholic though he was, should say at his investiture as cardinal in Rome that he could see no salvation for Christianity other than a new revelation. In effect, what Cardinal Neumann said was that he could see no salvation for Christianity other than a new revelation. But he had not the courage to take a new spiritual revelation seriously, and so it is with many others. You can read countless treatises today about what is needed in social life. Another book has recently appeared, Socialism, by Robert Wilbrand, the son of the poet. In it, the social question is discussed on the foundation of accurate and detailed knowledge. And, finally, it is stated that without the Spirit, nothing is achieved, that the very course of events shows that the Spirit is necessary. Yes, but what does such a man really achieve? He gets as far as to utter the word Spirit, to pronounce the abstract word Spirit, but he refuses to accept, indeed he rejects, anything that endeavors to make the Spirit really take effect. For that it is essential above all to realize that wallowing in abstractions, however loud the cry for the Spirit, is not yet spiritual, not yet Spirit. Vague, abstract chattering about the Spirit must never be confused with the active search for the content of the spiritual world pursued in anthroposophical science. Nowadays there is much talk about the Spirit, but you who accept spiritual science should not be deluded by such chattering. You should perceive the difference between it and the descriptions of the spiritual world attempted in anthroposophy, where the spiritual world is described as objectively as the physical world. You should probe into these differences, reminding yourselves repeatedly that abstract talk of the Spirit is a deviation from sincere striving for the Spirit, and that by their very talk people are actually removing themselves from the Spirit. Purely intellectual allusion to the Spirit leads nowhere. What then is intelligence? What is the content of our human intelligence? I can best explain this in the following way. Imagine, and this will be better understood by the many ladies present, imagine yourself standing in front of a mirror and looking into it. The picture presented to you by the mirror is you, but it has no reality at all. It is nothing but a reflection. All the intelligence within your soul, all the intellectual content, is only a mirror image. It has no reality. And just as your reflected image is called into existence through the mirror, so what mirrors itself as intelligence is called into existence through the physical apparatus of your body, through the brain. Man is intelligent only because his body is there. And as little as you can touch yourself by stretching your hand toward your reflected image, as little can you lay hold of the Spirit if you turn only to the intellectual, for the Spirit is not there. What is grasped through the intellect, ingenious as it may be, never contains the Spirit itself, but only a picture of the Spirit. You cannot truly experience the Spirit if you get no further than mere intelligence. The reason why intelligence is so seductive is that it yields a picture, a reflected picture of the Spirit, but not the Spirit itself. It seems unnecessary to go to the inconvenience of penetrating to the Spirit, because it is there, or so at least one imagines. In reality, it is only a reflected picture. But for all that, it is not difficult to talk about the Spirit. To distinguish the mere picture from the reality, that is the task of the tenor of soul, which does not merely theorize about spiritual science, but has actual perception of the Spirit. That is what I wanted to say to you today in order to intensify the earnestness which should pervade our whole attitude to the spiritual life as conceived by anthroposophy. For the evolution of humanity in the future will depend upon how truly this attitude is adopted by men of the present day. If what I have characterized in this lecture continues to be offered the reception that is still offered to it today by the vast majority of people on the earth, then Ahriman will be an evil guest when he comes. But if men are able to rouse themselves to take into their consciousness what we have been studying, if they are able so to guide it that humanity can freely confront the Ahrimanic influence, then when Ahriman appears, men will acquire, precisely through him, the power to realize that although the earth must enter inevitably into its decline, mankind is lifted above earthly existence through this very fact. And here we come to a chapter that must not be withheld from the knowledge of modern man. If in the future man were to do nothing himself toward acquiring a new wisdom, then unconsciously to him the whole of culture would become Ahrimanic, and it would be easy for the influences issuing from Ahriman's incarnation to permeate all civilization on the earth. Precautions must therefore be taken in regard to the streams by which the Ahrimanic form of culture is furthered. What would be the result if men were to follow the strong inclination they have today to let things drift on as they are, without understanding and guiding into right channels those streams which lead to an Ahrimanic culture? As soon as Ahriman incarnates at the destined time in the West, the whole of culture would be impregnated with his forces. What else would come in his train? Through certain stupendous arts, he would bring to man all the clairvoyant knowledge, which until then can be acquired only by dint of intense labor and effort. Men could live on as materialists. They could eat and drink as much as may be left after the war, and there would be no need for any spiritual efforts. The Ahrimanic streams would continue their unimpeded course. When Ahriman incarnates in the West at the appointed time, he would establish a great occult school for the practice of magic arts of the greatest grandeur, and what otherwise can be acquired only by strenuous effort would be poured over mankind. Let it never be imagined that Ahriman will appear as a kind of hoaxer, playing mischievous tricks on human beings. No, indeed. Lovers of ease, who refuse to have anything to do with spiritual science, would fall prey to his magic, for by means of these stupendous magic arts, he would be able to make great numbers of human beings into seers, but in such a way that the clairvoyance of each individual would be strictly differentiated. What one person would see, a second and a third would not see. Confusion would prevail, and in spite of being made receptive to clairvoyant wisdom, men would inevitably fall into strife on account of the sheer diversity of their visions. Ultimately, however, they would all be satisfied with their own particular vision, for each of them would be able to see into the spiritual world. In this way, all culture on the earth would fall prey to Ahriman. Men would succumb to Ahriman simply through not having acquired by their own efforts what Ahriman is ready and able to give them. No more evil advice could be given than to say, quote, "Stay just as you are. Ahriman will make all of you clairvoyant if you so desire, and you will desire it, because Ahriman's power will be very great." Close quote. But the result would be the establishment of Ahriman's kingdom on earth, and the overthrow of everything achieved hitherto by human culture. All the disastrous tendencies unconsciously cherished by mankind today would take effect. Our concern is that the wisdom of the future, a clairvoyant wisdom, shall be rescued from the clutches of Ahriman. Again, let it be repeated that there is only one book of wisdom, not two kinds of wisdom. The issue is whether this wisdom is in the hands of Ahriman or of Christ. It cannot come into the hands of Christ unless men fight for it. And they can only fight for it by telling themselves that by their own efforts they must assimilate the content of spiritual science before the time of Ahriman's appearance on earth. That, you see, is the cosmic task of spiritual science. It consists in preventing knowledge from becoming, or remaining, Ahrimanic. A good way of playing into Ahriman's hands is to exclude everything of the nature of knowledge from denominational religion, and to insist that simple faith is enough. If a man clings to this simple faith, he condemns his soul to stagnation, and then the wisdom that must be rescued from Ahriman cannot find entry. The point is not whether men do or do not simply receive the wisdom of the future, but whether they work upon it. And those who do must take upon themselves the solemn duty of saving earthly culture for Christ, just as the ancient Rishis and initiates pledged themselves not to yield to Lucifer's proviso that mankind be enticed away from the earth. The root of the matter is that for the wisdom of the future, too, a struggle is necessary, a struggle similar to that waged against Lucifer by the ancient initiates, through whose intermediary the faculties of speech and of thinking were transmitted to men. Just as it devolved upon the initiates of the primeval wisdom to wrest from Lucifer that which has become human reason, human intellect, so the insight which is to develop in the future into the inner realities of things must be wrested from the Ahrimanic powers. Such are the issues, and these issues play strongly into life itself. Such an impression can be understood in the light of the knowledge that we have to battle for the wisdom of the future, for the Ahrimanic powers do not allow this wisdom to be wrested from them without a struggle. Let it not be thought that wisdom can be attained through blissful visions. Real wisdom has to be acquired, quote, in travail and suffering, close quote. What I have just told you about the dying man is a very good picture of such suffering, for in this struggle for the wisdom of the future, one of the most frequent experiences is that the world is pressing in upon us as though the air had suddenly frozen into granite. It is possible to know why this is so. We have only to remember that it is the endeavor of the Ahrimanic powers to reduce the earth to a state of complete rigidification. Their victory would be won if they succeeded in bringing earth, water, and air into this rigidified state. Were that to happen, the earth could not again acquire the Saturn warmth from which it proceeded, and which must be regained in the Vulcan epoch, and to prevent this is the aim of the Ahrimanic powers. A trend which has an important bearing on this is the lack of enthusiasm in human souls at the present time for the content of spiritual science. If this lack of enthusiasm were to persist, the first impulse toward the rigidification of the earth would emanate from the souls of men themselves, from their apathy, their indolence, and love of ease. If you reflect that this rigidification is the aim of the Ahrimanic powers, you will not be surprised that compression, that feeling that life is becoming granite-like, is one of the experiences that must be undergone in the struggle for the wisdom of the future. But remember that men today can prepare themselves to look into the spiritual world by apprehending with their healthy human reason what spiritual science has to offer. The effort applied in study that lets itself be guided by healthy human reason can be part of the struggle which leads eventually to vision of the spiritual world. Many tendencies will have to be overcome, but for men of today the fundamental difficulty is that when they want to understand spiritual science, they have to battle against their own granite-like skulls. If the human skull were less hard, less granite-like, spiritual science would be far more widely accepted at the present time, infinitely more effective than any Philistine avoidance of the Ahrimanic powers would be to battle against Ahriman through sincere, genuine study of the content of spiritual science. But then man would gradually come to perceive spiritually the danger that must otherwise befall the earth physically of being rigidified into granite-like density. And so it must be emphasized that the wisdom of the future can be attained only through privations, travail, and pain. It must be attained by enduring the attendant sufferings of body and soul for the sake of the salvation of human evolution. Therefore, the unwavering principle should be never to let oneself be deterred by suffering from the pursuit of this wisdom. So far as the external life of mankind is concerned, what is needed is that in the future the danger of the frozen rigidification, which, to begin with, would manifest in the moral sphere, shall be removed from the earth. But this can happen only if men envisage spiritually, feel inwardly, and counter with their will what would otherwise become physical reality. At bottom, it is simply due to faint-heartedness that men today are unwilling to approach spiritual science. They are not conscious of this, but it is so nevertheless. They are fearful of the difficulties that will have to be encountered on every hand. When people come to spiritual science, they so often speak of the need for upliftment. By this they usually mean a sense of comfort and inner well-being. But that cannot be offered, for it would simply lull men into stupor and draw them away from the light they need. What is essential is that from now onward, knowledge of the driving forces of evolution must not be withheld from mankind. It must be realized that in very truth the human being is balanced, as it were, between the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic powers, and that the Christ has become a companion of men, leading them first away from the battle with Lucifer and then into the battle with Ahriman. The evolution of humanity must be understood in the light of these facts. One who presents secrets of cosmic existence in the way that must be done in spiritual science is often laughed to scorn, for example, about the use of the principle of the number 7, as you will find in my book titled Theosophy. But you will notice that people do not laugh when the rainbow is described as sevenfold, or the scale, tonic, second, third, and so on, up to the octave, which is a repetition of the tonic. In the physical world, these things are accepted, but not when it comes to the spiritual. What must be regained here is something that was implicit in the old pagan wisdom. A last glimmer of this pagan wisdom is in regard to a matter like the principle of the number 7 is to be found in the Pythagorean school, which was actually a mystery school. You can read about Pythagoras today in any textbook, but you will never find any understanding of the reason why he based the world order on number. The reason was because in the ancient wisdom everything was based on number, and a last glimmer of insight into the wisdom contained in numbers still survived when Pythagoras founded his school. Other branches of the ancient wisdom survived much longer, some indeed until the 6th and 7th centuries of the Christian era. Up to that time, many true things about the higher worlds are said in the sphere of what is called natural philosophy. And then, gradually, this primeval intelligence in mankind ran dry, if I may use this expression. If you were to search through modern psychology, you would not find the slightest trace of any attempt to get to the root of these far-reaching matters. After the lecture, in a, in quotes, discussion, as it was called, certain learned members of the audience got up to speak. One of these philosophers made a really splendid statement to the following effect. He said, quote, "What we have been hearing could not possibly be a concern of serious science. Serious science has other very different matters with which to occupy itself. Man can know nothing of what has just been put before us so plausibly. None of it is a concern of human cognition. Moreover, we have known it all for a long time." Close quote. In other words, therefore, what we cannot know is something with which we have long been familiar. Now, contradictions do exist, but contradictions of this kind exist only in the heads of present-day scholars. If someone says that certain things cannot be known, that they are not objects of human cognition, well and good, that is his opinion. But if he says in the same breath that he has known all about them for a long time, then there is an obvious contradiction. Erudite scholars of today often have a habit of placing two diametrically opposite opinions side by side in this way. This kind of thinking has a great deal to do with the present situation. An individual, thanks to the divine powers, and also, be it remembered, to Lucifer and Ahriman, is often able to form a fairly sound judgment of these things. But when it comes to presenting them to the world, that is a different matter altogether. Many people are willing to embark upon the study of spiritual science, provided they find a society of rather sectarian tendencies in which they can take refuge. But when they have to face the world and present something of which the world itself possesses evidence, everything is apt to go up in smoke, and they become veritable Philistines. And then Ahriman's progress is greatly furthered. Our reflections yesterday will have shown you that in order to get insight into the real driving forces in human development and human nature, we must take full account of the powers of Lucifer, of Christ, and of Ahriman, and of their effect. These powers have certainly already been in play during the course of world evolution, and yet they were active in spheres that did not require human beings to have clear awareness of the way in which they worked. The very purpose of our fifth post-Atlantean epoch is that we increasingly acquire awareness of what works through us into earthly existence. It would actually already be necessary to reveal far, far more of the living mysteries of humanity if humanity had a greater inclination to absorb things in a more factual and objective way. But without certain insights of the kind indicated yesterday, humanity will make no progress initially either with the social realm or with inner life. Consider for a moment something that relates to our reflections on society, in which we have now been engaging for several months. They aim to show the need to separate cultural and spiritual life, as well as the life of rights or the state, from merely economic life. Above all, they aim to establish conditions across the world, or at least, and we cannot presently do more than this, to see that conditions across the world will be right if they establish an autonomous life of spirit, one that is independent of the other structures in society, unlike our present cultural and spiritual life, which is fully entangled with economic life on the one hand and the political life of the state on the other. Either modern civilized humanity will have to adjust to this kind of autonomous life of culture and spirit, or modern civilization will decline and degenerate. If you do not believe yet that things are as serious as I suggest, then you are in a sense furthering preparations for Ahriman's incarnation in the future. Today already, one can discern in outward things, outward realities of human life, aspects that can inform us of this truth. Ahriman's incarnation will benefit very especially from a refusal to establish an autonomous, free life of spirit, instead leaving this entangled in economic circulation or in the life of the state. This is because Ahrimanic powers have the greatest interest in maintaining this merger of spiritual life with economic life and the state. Ahrimanic powers regard a free life of spirit as a kind of darkness, and they will experience human interest in this free life of spirit as a burning fire, a soul fire, but nevertheless a powerfully blazing fire. Therefore, in order to find the right stance toward the incarnation of Ahriman in the near future, we are obliged to establish this free life of spirit. But nowadays there is still a strong tendency to conceal the realities we spoke of yesterday. The great majority of people conceal these things since they do not wish to contemplate the truth, the reality in things, preferring to delude themselves with words that are divorced from realities. Sometimes this endeavor to avoid approaching realities at all costs is one we might call honest and well-meaning. Centralized state as such, irrespective of its particular constitution and structure, whether it is a democracy, republic, monarchy, or what have you, is a path to Ahriman's incarnation, unless it is given a threefold tripartite form. All such things are therefore merely declamatory. Even this recent, quote, world circular, close quote, by Romain Rolland. People do not grasp realities, since they can only be comprehended if one recognizes how things must be deepened through spiritual perception. And here it is necessary to delve very deeply and thoroughly into the nature and essence of things. I'm sure you know a text widely spoken in the world, quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and a God was the Word." Close quote. Try for a moment to determine whether people regard these words with all due gravity. They utter them, but just as a phrase. You can see this from the following. Most people place no importance on the fact that these lines are spoken in the imperfect tense. Quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and a God was the Word." Close quote. Here, word must at the same time have its older ancient Greek meaning. It is not the word as people understand it today, merely a signifying sound, but the inward spirit. But the imperfect tense is used to refer to this word too. Quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and a God was the Word." Close quote. And so, one has to say that since the Word was in the beginning, it no longer is. Otherwise, the text would have to say, quote, "Now is the Word," close quote. Nor is the Word with God, but was with God. And God was the Word, and so no longer is. This is the way the text appears in the Gospel of St. John itself. For what would otherwise be meant if it said, quote, "And the Word has become flesh and has been dwelling among us," close quote. The text relates, after all, to what lies in the further development of the Word. And by word is meant everything that we can gain through our intelligence as intellectual wisdom. We must be clear that everything we can acquire through what is represented here by the Word is not what modern people should seek today and in the near future. If the text was to address something present now, it would really have to read, quote, "Let the human being seek the Spirit revealed in the Word. For the Spirit is with God, and the Spirit is a God," close quote. Humanity has to move forward from the Word to the Spirit, to perception and knowledge of the Spirit. As I recall these first words of the Gospel of John, you can see how disinclined people are today to take these things really seriously, to really go beyond a merely arbitrary interpretation, such as is commonly given today to the most serious matters. We need to see that in our human nature, too, we must scrutinize what intelligence signifies and illumine it through what is revealed in spiritual vision. Though spiritual vision itself is not always the essential thing, so much as understanding of what has been spiritually perceived. I have repeatedly stressed that it is not only the clairvoyant who can understand the truth of what is clairvoyantly perceived, but every person, since people now certainly possess the maturity to comprehend the spiritual element in human nature. They need only resolve to exert themselves and not rest too comfortably on their laurels. But for people to raise themselves to this fitting level, they must accord due seriousness to things such as those with which we ended yesterday's reflections. Yesterday, citing a somewhat trivial example, I showed how easily numbers can deceive us. But surely people have a superstitious belief in numbers today. Anything that can be enumerated is accepted as scientific. Science is enamored of weighing, measuring, and counting. In the social sciences, statistics are greatly prized. Likewise, just a kind of weighing and counting. It will be very hard indeed for humanity to recognize that everything, absolutely everything that measure and number tell us of the outer world is illusory. Look, what does measuring mean? It means comparing against a standard. I can measure a line if I repeatedly compare it against a small rule. If you measure something, irrespective of whether it be lengths, surfaces, or weights, no account is taken of qualities. The number 3 is always the same number, whether you use it to count sheep, people, or politicians. No quality is indicated by the number, only quantity. But this means that everything we obtain in the form of number becomes mere smoke and mirrors. And we must recognize that at the moment we enter the world that can be weighed and measured, that is, the world of space and time as it is given to us, we enter also a world of illusion, one that is a mere mirage, as long as we view it as a reality. This is really the ideal of contemporary thinking, to learn what all things in the temporal and spatial world signify, whereas in fact, what these things signify is only their external aspect. And we must go beyond time and space to delve further and deeper if we wish to arrive at truth and essence. Thus a future time will come where people will say, quote, yes, I can grasp the natural world around me with my intelligence, can do so as is, for instance, the ideal pursued by science. But this view I acquire is purely Ahrimanic, close quote. This doesn't mean we should reject science, that it ought not to exist, no. But we should remember that this science gives us only an Ahrimanic mirage. Why is this? Why should we keep this science even though it offers us only smoke and mirrors? Because we are in a declining phase of earthly evolution. We are a being already in decline. If you look back to the fourth of the 5 post-Atlantean epochs, you find that people at the time had reached the highest relative point of knowledge and perception, whereas we are now already in decline. And in this state of relative decline, as I have explained before from various angles, our weakening corporeal nature would not cope with perceiving the world as the ancient Greeks still did. Quote, outward history, close quote, says nothing of this, of course. How would our worthy historians respond to such an idea today? They tell of the Greeks as if speaking of some region of the contemporary world, because they do not know that these Greeks looked upon nature with different eyes, that they listened out into the world with different ears than we possess. People today, and the historians will not tell you this, would continually get a headache or migraine if they saw and heard in their surroundings what the ancient Greeks saw and heard. The Greeks lived far more intensely in the external life of the sense world. In comparison, we have already died away from such a living grasp of our outer surroundings. For us to cope with it, we have to be presented with a mere mirage of these outer surroundings. That is indeed what is presented to us. What we do not merely see with our senses, but what we dream in scientific ideas about our outer surroundings, is most of all a mirage. Those who dream most about this outer world are the very ones who think they are most realistic in their thinking. Darwin or John Stuart Mill are real dreamers. The real dreamers are the ones who think they are most realistic. But we cannot entirely rely on our interior life. There are many among you who can see from the developments that occurred in the Theosophical Society that merely pursuing interior experience, if done as many people today endeavor to, will not lead to anything that it should, since we must lead ourselves and not simply be led. Often, instead of reaching beyond ordinary life to higher vision or insight in freedom through our own resolve, appeal is made to the unfree aspect of the human being. All kinds of hallucinatory capacities for illusion, are invoked instead. But we ought to say this to ourselves. Just as outward science becomes Ahrimanic, so higher evolution of human interiority simply becomes Luciferic, if we mystically deepen this inner life that is innate in us. Anyone who, without any self-education, which is described in the book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, undertakes to mystically deepen what already lies within him, will find the Luciferic awakening within him and gaining particular ascendancy. And from this you will see that the Luciferic element appears and arises today in anyone who even begins to brood on his interior experience. This element is actually terribly powerful today in contemporary humanity. It comes to expression in an egoism that most people do not even discern in themselves. Just consider how often we meet people who are satisfied with something they have done, who, as they may often say, have accomplished something that appears to them beyond reproof, according to their best knowledge and conscience. This is a purely Luciferic perspective on things. You see, it doesn't at all matter in life whether we need to reprove ourselves or not, but rather that we perceive things objectively, that we comprehend and grasp them quite distinct from ourselves, that we comprehend the world and accomplish our actions in accordance with the objective course of realities. Most people today do not seek any objective penetration of the matter in hand, any discernment of how things should be done that is drawn from world historical necessities. For this reason, precisely on spiritual scientific foundations, we must emphasize the objective nature of things, thus that Ahriman is preparing his incarnation, and how we need to relate to this fact as human beings. In such questions, it really does not matter whether we need to reprove ourselves or not for the way in which we have done something. No, we must learn to discern objective phenomena. We must learn to perceive what acts in the world, and for the world's sake, conduct ourselves accordingly. But all this tends to the conclusion that as modern people we can only properly judge and evaluate things if we recognize that we hover, really, between two extremes. Between the Ahrimanic on the one hand, which offers us an outward mirage, and the Luciferic within, which infiltrates us with illusions, hallucinations, and so on. Today people live out their Ahrimanic inclinations in science, and their Luciferic ones in religion. And in the realm of art, they oscillate between the one and the other. In recent times, some artists tended more toward the Luciferic, others toward the Ahrimanic. Those of a more Luciferic bent became expressionists, while those of a more Ahrimanic inclination became impressionists. And those who wish neither to follow the one nor the other school oscillate between them, with no proper judgment either of the Luciferic or the Ahrimanic, seeking to avoid both. Not Ahriman, I must and will not go there, for then I succumb to the Ahrimanic. Or, not the Luciferic, that must not be. And such people seek to be very decent and succumb neither to the Ahrimanic nor the Luciferic. But that is not what it's about. Rather, we should regard Ahrimanic and Luciferic impulses as two necessary scales. The scale beam balancing both is what we ourselves must be. That is the important thing. How can we educate ourselves to do this? We can do so by imbuing ourselves very strongly with a Luciferic element to counter what arises in us as Ahrimanic quality. What Ahrimanic element arises very strongly in us today? Knowledge of the outer world. The most Ahrimanic element of all is our material perception of the outer world, for this is only a mirage. And if we can develop keen, fervent, and enthusiastic interest in the mirage that arises from chemistry, physics, astronomy, and so on, through our own Luciferic interest, we detach from Ahriman something that should belong to him. It is precisely this that people do not want. It seems very boring to them. And many who flee outward material knowledge misjudge their task and prepare the very best earthly conditions for Ahriman's incarnation. Likewise, what springs up inside people today has a very strong Luciferic character. How can we educate ourselves properly in this respect? By taking our own Ahrimanic element and drawing it into ourselves. That is, avoiding all illusions about our interiority and regarding or observing ourselves as we otherwise regard the outer world. People today should really experience how needful they are of educating themselves in this way. Anyone with a certain capacity to observe these matters will frequently encounter the following fact of life. Someone comes to you and relates something he feels indignant about in the behavior of person A, person B, person C, and countless others. He describes very precisely how indignant he is about this, that, and the other person. And he has no idea that everything he relates are his own qualities or flaws. People have no sense at all of this. This idiosyncrasy has never been as widespread as it is today. And those who think this does not apply to them are the ones who do it most of all. What is involved here is to approach one's own interiority with Ahrimanic coldness, Ahrimanic sobriety. This interiority of ours will still be hot enough, even if cooled down a little. There's no need to fear that it will grow too cool. And it is true to say that modern humanity needs to find the right stance toward the forthcoming incarnation of Ahriman, to become more objective about inner life, at the same time bringing much subjective interest to bear on the surrounding world. Not fantasy, though, but attentiveness, devotion, and especially interest. You see, it is of great benefit to Ahriman and the path he is taking in order to shape his incarnation as favorably as possible if your education or other circumstances in life lead you to regard outward life as tedious. Just think how many people nowadays regard one thing or another as boring. For instance, I have met countless people who find it very boring indeed to acquaint themselves with the workings of banks, or the stock exchange, or single and double bookkeeping. It is never right to regard such things as utterly boring. To find something boring simply means that you haven't yet discovered the point where it comes to be of burning interest. Every dry accounts book can, if you discover the angle on it that makes it of keen interest, be just as interesting as the Maid of Orleans or Schiller or Shakespeare's Hamlet or anything else, say the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. It is just a question of discovering the point where everything in life turns out to be fascinating. You might consider this very paradoxical, but it isn't. What is paradoxical is people's relationship to the truth nowadays. It is a far, far better stance to assume that we ourselves are flawed and unable to accomplish something than to ascribe this weakness to the world itself. Nothing better helps Ahriman prepare for his incarnation than for us to find something or other boring, to consider ourselves too good for something, to not want to have anything to do with whatever it is. We must always look for the point or angle that allows us to see the interest in something. Rather than subjectively rejecting or accepting things, it is important to objectively perceive the extent to which there is Ahrimanic or Luciferic quality in something, so that the balance beam sinks too low on the one side or the other. Finding something interesting does not mean regarding it as right or justified, but only developing an inner strength to unite with the matter in hand and help send it in the right direction. You may recall, it's a long time ago now, that a number of our friends bought some books on mathematics, a kind of theosophical sport developed in which people were buying Lübsen's books on mathematics. But after a while they put them back on their shelves and left them there, showing little sign of any emerging mathematical knowledge. Of course, I'm not suggesting that you ought to revive such things straight away. I'm not making any such demands. And yet, taking up a subject that is of no interest to you, finding the point where you develop new insight into the world, is of huge importance. Something like this is certainly needed today. Such things should be taken seriously. Things also, such as those I wanted to impress on you in our reflections here, about the way in which Lucifer and Ahriman intervene in humanity's evolution alongside the Christ impulse. Now, if Luciferic wisdom had never existed, the gnosis of the early centuries would not have enabled people to gain understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. For as Luciferic wisdom grew decadent, understanding of the mystery of Golgotha also gradually declined. And today, yes, where should we now seek this understanding? Those who can understand the nature of external Ahrimanic science realize that it cannot be found there. I wished only to show that there is a yearning within people to move forward, but that they are still slumbering and do not see how powers are at work that suppress this longing. And then there is usually a lack of courage to really express this yearning outwardly, to bring it to the surface. But consider what the effect might be of insight, say, into Ahriman's forthcoming human incarnation, and of how he is preparing this through things I described today and yesterday. We need to gain objective awareness of such matters, so that we can adopt the right stance to everything occurring around us as preparation for the incarnation of Ahriman in the future. Only if you reflect thoroughly and maturely on what we have said about such Ahrimanic currents in life will you be able to consider these things with the seriousness they deserve. Anyone who studies human evolution particularly in the 19th century and on into the 20th century, will find that there is justification in saying that technology has made very considerable progress in depriving man of his capacity to work. When it is said that the earth has so many 100 million inhabitants, this is not really quite correct, because one can also reckon how many inhabitants the earth has according to how much work is done. However, it would be perfectly justifiable to say that since the last third of the 18th century, human labor has been carried out by the machines that have gradually been produced. One can gauge, and fairly precisely, how many millions of additional people the earth would have if all the work that is undertaken by machines were to be carried out by human beings. The earth would need to have 500 million extra people. It can indeed be said that there are on the earth not only those people who have 2 legs and a head and who can be statistically counted, but 500 million more people, if measured according to work capacity. But the labor is being performed by machines. However, there is nothing material that does not have a spiritual dimension in the background. These 500 million human forces represent an opportunity for the equivalent number of Ahrimanic demons to take up their abode in human culture. These Ahrimanic demons are indeed present, and Oriental people strongly repudiate these Ahrimanic demons out of a certain instinct. They don't like them at all. You see, this in every case of a highly cultured Oriental. He rejects this Ahrimanic demonology. For this Ahrimanic demonology gives people a certain heaviness, which rules out the possibility of any fulfillment of the aim of Oriental initiation, namely, that by the middle of the 6th post-Atlantean epoch the human race will physically cease to exist on the earth. Human beings will be held back by what is being developed in this demonically Ahrimanic way. The initiates of Americanism have a different aim in view. Indeed, their goal is a completely opposite one. Their endeavor is to form a more intimate bond than is normally the case in human evolution between human souls and that bodily nature that will be found on earth, the dense, coarse physicality that will come to exist on earth from the 6th post-Atlantean epoch onward. The soul culture will be greatly intensified, but the bodily aspect will be coarse. In the American West, the aim will be to cultivate a closer connection with this coarse physicality than is normally the case, a deeper penetration into one's bodily nature. There will be a reaching toward what is seeping through, see diagram left, brought about by a deeper immersion in the body. Whereas Orientals want to establish a culture where human bodies have no place in the future evolution of the earth, the aim of the American culture of the West is to chain human souls to this subsequent earthly evolution. To the extent that this can be achieved, bodies will be formed in such a way that once souls have passed through death, they will be able to descend once more, as quickly as possible, into a body and spend the minimum amount of time in the spiritual world. Human souls will be held back as much as possible from residing for any length of time in the spiritual world. The aim is that they return to the earth as rapidly as they can, that they are intimately connected with earthly life. These are tendencies that one must recognize. However strange it may appear to people today to speak of these tendencies, it will be harmful to them if they are overlooked. For it is necessary that they enter with full consciousness into what is required of them, with regard to which they unfortunately often behave in such a way as to justify the remark that they simply allow things to take their course. However, this Western ideal, this tendency to allow demons to hold sway over man, can be attained only if the sole spiritual aspect of Americanism can be supported by another stream or world conception that is far more closely connected with Americanism than one might think. As you have seen, the most striking feature of Americanism is its inclination toward an Ahrimanic culture. But this aspect of American culture would receive a considerable stimulus from another world conception, which is far more closely related to it than one might suppose. This is Jesuitism. Jesuitism and Americanism are two phenomena which have much to do with one another. For at the beginning of the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, it was a question of finding an impulse through which a situation could be created where people were led as far as possible from an understanding of Christ. And the cultural impulse that set itself the task of bringing this about, of completely undermining all understanding of Christ, is Jesuitism. The aim of Jesuitism is gradually to eradicate any possibility of understanding the Christ. For what lies at its foundation is associated with a deep mystery. Man's capacity to receive something from without, see diagram right, into his inner being has always been associated, as I have said, with the atavistic clairvoyance that human beings had prior to the 7th and 8th centuries of the pre-Christian era. Moreover, as a result of this atavistic clairvoyance, they also beheld Christ in the cosmos. The Christ was an object of their perception in the old clairvoyance. I have often pointed this out. I described it in Occult Science, title Occult Science, also known as Title and Outline of Esoteric Science. And the whole meaning of my book, titled Christianity as Mystical Fact, ultimately culminates in this idea. Christ was seen in the cosmos. Christ was seen in the universe. But now consider this. From the 7th and 8th pre-Christian centuries, human beings have lost the possibility of beholding the universe. What, then, would people have lost if nothing else had happened, through being unable any longer to look out into the universe? What would they have lost? They would have lost the possibility of knowing anything at all about a Christ spirit had the Christ not come down to the earth. At the historical moment of time, when human beings were no longer able to perceive Christ in the cosmos, Christ came down to the earth and united himself with Jesus. From then on, it has been man's task to understand how Christ dwells within him. And some way needs to be found of ensuring that together with what is seeping through here, see the left of the diagram, the Christ is recognized. For Christ has descended to mankind. Jesus is a human being in whom the Christ has dwelt. True human self-knowledge must be the bearer of the germinal impulse of Jesus, so that it will be possible to move on into the future. It is deeply significant that we speak of a Christ Jesus, for Christ corresponds to the cosmic aspect, but this cosmic element has come down to the earth and has taken up his abode in Jesus. And Jesus corresponds to the earthly realm, together with the entire future of the earth. If there is an endeavor to sever man's connection with the spiritual world, he will also lose his connection with Christ. The possibility then arises to make use of Jesus in such a way that the earth continues to exist only in its earthly aspect, You will therefore find in Jesuitism a continual battle against Christology, and indeed a strong emphasis on there being an army for Jesus. It is not surprising that spiritual science should be a means for making these things known, for causing the scales to fall from people's eyes. Hence, those who do not want to be recognized will become increasingly angry about the aims of spiritual science, and the fury grows. Unfortunately, however, one speaks of these things mostly to people who are asleep. People love to sleep through the most important things, and to fail to listen to what is actually determining the future. As I said the day before yesterday, everything will come upon people as a surprise. They even want to be surprised. If one speaks at the earliest possible moment about things that are of crucial relevance to the time, people regard this as upsetting. For as worthy members of the bourgeoisie, they would rather sit comfortably in their armchairs for as long as possible, even if they hold responsible leading positions in society. But those who are interested in spiritual science should have it engraved in their souls that everything will be done to make spiritual science ineffective. Above all, it is not exactly a good thing when even we in our circles are only too inclined to sleep where what is going on in the world is concerned. Sometimes it is hard to see that all the personal goings-on are given a higher place than what is of such particular importance and significance in our present time, namely attending to the great concerns of humanity as they are gradually unfolding. The attacks, which have to do with powerful will impulses, come from a great variety of sources of opposition, which need to be taken seriously. Such an attack as the one to which I have referred must in a certain sense be taken more seriously. One has to be able to assess it in the right way. Less serious attention should be given to those snide attacks that constantly well up from the subterranean regions of our society, and which to some extent have an evil aspect, merely because again and again one can observe the tendency for there to be the greatest and most ardent sympathy for those people who malign and seek to denigrate what is striven for in our circles. Only when the harm has been done do people gradually decide to look properly for themselves. But up to now, many people have been lionized who have gone on to do damage. I say this not because I think that one thing or another should be different, but because I feel obliged to draw attention to the need for humanity to wake up and to the great importance of our being among those who are striving for the truth. In certain spheres today, more or less anything can be achieved. But the sleep of humanity to which I have referred, which can be overcome only by gaining insight into the spiritual worlds, is extraordinarily difficult to overcome. And with respect to the dissemination of spiritual scientific knowledge, one has to wrestle even more with this sleep than with opponents. I am not referring to any particular instance of this, but in our whole cultural environment there is something sleepy about the very impulses that are sprouting everywhere from people's heads. Two things need to be engraved in one's soul today like golden rules. Never has there been such a need as in our fifth post-Atlantean epoch for people to make an increasing effort, which I do not doubt that they can succeed in doing, to achieve what is of such particular value: understanding spiritual scientific knowledge. It is true that spiritual scientific knowledge has to be sought through clairvoyant insight into the spiritual world. That is a necessity. It goes without saying that there must be clairvoyance to research into the spiritual world, that there must be those who strive for spiritual knowledge. Secondly, however, it is of particular importance that people are found who are, by virtue of their intellectual power, able to understand this spiritual scientific knowledge, this knowledge that has been sought in supersensible worlds. The rational grasp of spiritual science is vitally necessary today, for it is the means whereby the opposing cultural forces are overcome. Man's intellect today is so vast that the whole of spiritual science can be understood where there is a will. Moreover, cultivating an understanding of this nature is a matter of universal cultural interest and not an egotistical affair. For such an understanding can be striven for if those intellectual forces, which are employed today in scientific domains on all sorts of trivial projects, frittered away in modern economic life, and moreover applied in a futile and perhaps even soul-destroying technology, are to be used in a suitable way, so that people are no longer misguided from their earliest childhood onward. One would then see how easily the treasures of spiritual knowledge could indeed be channeled toward an understanding of humanity. This is the one aspect. The other golden rule is this, that something more is needed today if the gifts of the Spirit are to be made fruitful for our culture. The first is something that must be wrested from Ahriman. People today are so clever, for Ahriman sees to it that this is so. And oh, how clever people are. But they apply their cleverness only for materialistic ends. People are not merely clever, they are super clever. We shall speak of this further in the coming lectures, in order that you may see what an immense influence the Ahrimanic element has on the super cleverness of modern times. But something else is also necessary. Much still needs to be wrested from another spirit. We need not merely cleverness with which to gain a real insight into spiritual knowledge, but we need above all, and with the greatest urgency, the words are barely adequate, qualities of liveliness, enthusiasm, fire, and warmth in those human souls who are the recipients of these spiritual gifts. We need people who can demonstrate the reality of these spiritual riches with the whole of their souls. It is in the realm of the inner life that this knowledge must be wrested from the Luciferic powers, which are now so active in the world. There is a beautiful vista. It is the picture of someone who, in calm clarity, but with an inner fire and enthusiasm, because it is for him a necessity, is able to engender an inner warmth for this spiritual knowledge. But there is another picture, that of someone who tries to lull himself to sleep by means of this spiritual knowledge, to become dreamy and imbued with warmth, to expand into the forces of the universe and unite his soul with the divine all. These are contrasts that can easily be observed at the present time, contrasts which it is necessary to observe. For it will not be easy to incorporate what we receive from the Spirit into human culture. And yet this must be done. Human culture needs it. People will not only have to learn to think very differently, they will also have to feel and experience things in a different way. Well, I could say a lot more about what I have just said, but I would prefer to stop now, so that you have the opportunity to think about it. There is much food for thought in what has been aroused by deceitfulness of various kinds, which I have deliberately included in the substance of what I have presented. We shall continue to speak of these things when next we meet. The Luciferic influx into human sensibility gradually faded in the human soul, making way increasingly for what we call the Ahrimanic impulse, which will grow ever stronger in the near and also the further future. The Ahrimanic impulse derives from beings other than Christ or Lucifer, yet it is also a supersensible influx, and we could say a supersensible being, there is little distinction, whose influence will become especially powerful, ever more and more so, in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. If we consider the turbulence of recent years, we will find that it has been caused in particular by Ahrimanic powers. Like the incarnation of Lucifer at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, and the Christ incarnation at the time of the mystery of Golgotha, there will be an incarnation in the West of the being of Ahriman in the 3rd millennium AD, sometime after our current life on earth has ended. We only properly comprehend the course of history and human evolution over almost 6 millennia if we see it in these terms: a Luciferic incarnation at one pole, the Christ incarnation in the middle of this period, and the incarnation of Ahriman at the other pole. Lucifer is the power in us which stirs up all quixotic and fervent powers, all false mysticism, all that seeks to elevate us arrogantly beyond our actual capacities. In a sense, it brings our blood into chaotic disorder in order to lift us out of ourselves. Ahriman, on the other hand, is the power that makes a person prosaic, hard-headed, Philistine, that ossifies us and persuades us of the illusory truth of materialism. Basically, our human nature is the effort to maintain equilibrium between the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic power. And in modern times, the Christ impulse aids us in creating this balance or equilibrium. These two poles are always present in us, the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic. But in historical terms, we find that the Luciferic impulse predominated in certain streams of cultural evolution in the pre-Christian period and through into the early Christian centuries, whereas Ahriman has been active since the mid-15th century and is growing ever stronger until eventually an actual incarnation of Ahriman will occur within Western humanity. Now, it is intrinsic to such things that they are long prepared beforehand. Just as Lucifer once appeared in human form in China, and Christ Jesus appeared in human form in the Near East, so Ahrimanic powers are preparing human evolution in a way that will allow humanity to succumb to Ahriman when he eventually appears in human form in Western civilization, which will scarcely any longer be civilization as we know it. There is no use entertaining illusions about such things. Ahriman will appear in human form. All that will matter is the degree to which he finds humankind prepared for his arrival. Whether his preparations will enable him to enlist all humanity, all civilization as we know it, to follow his dictates, or whether he will find a humanity that can offer him resistance. Illusions are of no help here. Nowadays, people try to evade the truth, and one cannot present it to them plain and unvarnished, because they would mock and ridicule such ideas. But nor can one present such things to them as I tried to do now in the form of the threefold social organism. The majority of them, at least, do not wish to hear about this either. In fact, this refusal to countenance such things is one of the means that Ahrimanic powers can employ to ensure that when Ahriman appears in human form, he will have the greatest possible number of adherents on earth. This refusal to engage with the most important truths will pave the way for Ahriman to thrive in his incarnation. You see, in seeking the right stance toward what will unfold in human evolution through Ahriman, nothing will help except an open-minded perception of the powers which Ahriman employs to act upon us, as well as the powers that can arm humanity against the temptations and ensnarements of Ahrimanic powers. Today, therefore, let us cast a look, at least from various perspectives, on the kinds of things that would consolidate people's adherence to Ahriman, and which now especially the Ahrimanic powers are sending down from supersensible worlds, sending also through human sensibilities, in order to secure as great a following as possible. One such means is to obstruct people's understanding of the importance for the human being of certain prevalent types of thinking. You know that there was a huge difference between the way a person felt in relation to the whole cosmos in, say, Egyptian times, and still in Greek times, and how he felt at the beginning of the modern era, after the medieval period had ended. If you imagine an ancient Egyptian fully versed in these things, he would have known that he is not only bodily constituted of substances found here on earth, manifest in the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms, but that his being was informed by an influx of powers that he saw above in the stars. He felt himself to be part of the whole cosmos. He felt the whole cosmos to be not only animate, but also ensouled and spiritualized. And in his awareness there lived something of the spiritual entelechy of the cosmos, the soul nature of the cosmos, the life of the cosmos. All this was lost in the course of modern human history. Today the human being gazes up from his earth to the starry world, where he sees planets, stars, suns, comets, and so forth. But what means does he use to observe everything he sees up there in the cosmos, all that gazes down upon him? He uses mathematics, and at most also mechanical laws. Everything that encompasses the earth is now void of spirit, soul, and even life for him. The cosmos is now seen really as a great mechanical construct that can only be understood with the aid of mathematical and mechanical laws. Employing these laws, we understand it wonderfully well. This is not to say that a spiritual scientist will not fully value the achievements of Galileo, Kepler, and others. But what enters human comprehension and human awareness through the teachings of these great figures reveals the universe to be nothing but a vast mechanism. What this means for our view of reality can be seen only by someone able to trace the full scope of human nature. Astronomers and astrophysicists posit the universe as a mechanism that can be comprehended and calculated through mathematical formula, and a worldview such as this is one people can certainly credit from the moment they wake up in the morning to when they fall asleep again at night. But in the unconscious depths, people do not reach with their waking consciousness, but which belong to their existence nevertheless, and in which they live during sleep, a quite different sense of things, a different comprehension of the universe flows into the human soul. A knowledge then lives within us that we are not consciously aware of, but that lives below in the depths of our soul and configures it. A knowledge of the spirit, of the life of the soul, of the life of the cosmos. And while people are unaware in their waking consciousness of what occurs in them in community with the spirit, soul, and life of the universe, from the time they fall asleep to the moment they wake up, these things nevertheless live in the soul. Much of the split in modern human beings is caused by the disharmony between the soul's experience of the universe during sleep and its avowed view of the universe in waking awareness. The whole spirit and import of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science tells you that while Galileo and Copernicus introduced into humanity a view of the universe that is grandiose and mighty, this is not an absolute truth, but just one aspect of the cosmos, one way of looking at it. It is arrogant of modern humankind to say that the Ptolemaic system is childish, that people thought like this when humanity was still in its infancy. The idea that we have now attained some kind of absolute truth through our, quote, glorious advancements, close quote, is mistaken. This worldview is no more absolute than the Ptolemaic system was, just one perspective. Anthroposophically oriented spiritual science can teach us that mere cosmic mathematics, all schemata of a mechanical nature, do not provide us with an absolute truth, but give us illusions about the cosmos. This is not to say that we do not need these illusions. They are intrinsic to the particular evolutionary stage we are passing through, and educative for us, as other views were intrinsic to other stages and educative. We have to appropriate them, but we must also know that they are illusory. And they become even more illusory when we carry them on into our everyday surroundings in atomistic teachings about matter, finding a kind of small-scale astronomy in molecular theory, in the nature of the Earth's substances. A true perspective on modern science, wherever it posits such things, will recognize that this is all founded on illusion. Ahriman, hoping that his incarnation will be as fruitful as possible for him, is most keenly interested in human beings perfecting this illusory science, which more or less accounts for all science today, but without them realizing that it is illusory. Ahriman has the very greatest interest in teaching people mathematics, but without them seeing that mathematical and mechanical views of the cosmos are mere illusion. He has the very greatest interest in teaching humanity chemistry, physics, biology, and so forth, which figure in our culture as greatly admired disciplines, but to make us believe, too, that they embody absolute truths rather than partial aspects. Photographs, if you like, from only one viewpoint. If you photograph a tree from one side only, it will give you a true, yet only a partial image. A fuller picture will emerge if you photograph it from four sides. Ahriman has the profoundest interest in concealing from humanity the fact that modern intellectual and rationalist science, with its credo of empiricism, is a great illusion. He would secure supreme, triumphant success if he could succeed in perpetuating into the third millennium these scientific superstitions so prevalent everywhere today, which even dictate the terms of social science. Born, then, as a human being, he would rejoice to find these scientific superstitions living within Western civilization. But do not draw the wrong conclusions from what I have now said. It would be mistaken to simply avoid and evade modern science. That would be the most misguided thing you could do. We should fully acquaint ourselves with it, but with full awareness that it offers us an illusory aspect, albeit necessary and educative for us at this stage of our evolution. We do not defend ourselves against Ahriman by avoiding modern science, but rather by acquainting ourselves with its true form and nature. This science inevitably gives us an outward illusion about the cosmos, and we need this. Please do not think that we do not need this outward illusion. but from a quite different angle and perspective, through spiritual research, we must fill it with true reality, advancing from its illusory character to the real truth. Numerous lecture cycles I have given emphasize what I am saying again today. I have always tried to engage fully with modern science, yet at the same time to lift it higher into the realm where we can perceive the extent to which it holds true. To wish away modern science is rather like wishing away a rainbow just because it is an illusion of light and color. To understand it fully, you will first have to comprehend its illusory character, and the same is true of all the ideas and concepts of the world which modern science offers. It offers only illusions, and we must see through them. By the very fact of penetrating these illusions, we educate ourselves to comprehend the world's reality. Keeping humankind locked in its scientific superstitions is one of the means employed by Ahriman to make his incarnation as effective as possible. The other means, a second means, is to encourage everything that divides people today, sunders them into small cliques and groupings at odds with one another. In the political arena, we can see this clearly today in all the parties and factions. If we study this phenomenon with an open mind, we can see that these parties feuding with each other cannot be explained by mere differences in human nature. You can't explain the Great War by referring to human disharmonies between different types of person, or differences of nation and race. Here it is very clear that non-sensory powers, Ahrimanic powers, have been exerting their influence. And these Ahrimanic powers are at work wherever disharmonies between groups of people arise. Let us take a very characteristic example to show what most of these things are based upon. Our modern proletariat now looks to Karl Marx. It is worth studying how the teachings of Karl Marx spread amongst the modern proletariat, and how they gave rise to a never-ending flood of Marxist literature. This literature fully embraces the scientific mode. Everything is rigorously supported with proof and evidence, so rigorously, in fact, that many one would have thought immune to Marxism have in fact succumbed to it. The fate of Marxism was to spread, first of all, through the proletariat, while academic institutions disputed and rejected it. Now there are a number of academics who can no longer resist the logic of Marxism, who acknowledge it and can no longer escape it, because Marxist literature, as has gradually become apparent, offers subtly congruent conclusions. With a modern scientific outlook and mode of thinking, the propositions of Marxism can be very nicely proven. The middle classes did not have their own Karl Marx to prove the opposite, but it would have been possible. You see, just as one can prove the ideological character of law and ethics, etc., and the theory of added value, and axioms of materialistic history from a Marxist perspective, so one could equally well prove exactly the opposite about all such things. It would be perfectly possible for a bourgeois Marx to prove exactly the opposite in the same rigorous way, without any distortion or underhand aims. Such evidence would certainly stand up. And this is because modern human thinking, the modern intellect, lies in a stratum of our being that prevents it reaching down to access realities. This is why one can prove one thing and then its opposite equally well, both with an equally rigorous procedure. Today it is possible with equally valid logic to prove the truth of spiritualism on the one hand and materialism on the other. These conflicting perspectives can feud with each other with equal right, because modern intellectualism lives in an upper stratum of reality and does not plumb the depths of existence. The same applies to partisan viewpoints of all kinds. If we do not comprehend this, but simply absorb such things through our upbringing, family, through the particular conditions we live in, and the politics of the day, we may honestly believe our partisan view to be well-founded, and yet we have just fallen or slipped into it, and find ourselves in conflict with people who have likewise slipped into their own partisan position. Both positions will be equally valid, and this brings chaos and confusion over humanity. The convulsions it causes will continually increase if humanity does not come to see this. And this confusion is something that Ahrimanic powers employ, again, to prepare their triumphant incarnation, driving humankind ever more strongly into something it finds so difficult to comprehend. That one thing and its very opposite can be equally proven with the same well-founded intellectual or scientific reasoning. We have to recognize that anything can be proven, and it is in this light that we should see the proofs hammered out in modern academic discourse. Only in a science, in the strict meaning of the word, the strict study of phenomena, can realities become apparent. But in no other field should one allow merely intellectual proofs to hold sway. Human knowledge and perception must be sought at a deeper level, as in the practice of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science, than in the stratum of our being where evidence and proof originates. And only then can we avoid the danger of succumbing to the Ahrimanic temptation that increasingly drags us down into these things. In our era, Ahriman also uses everything founded on genetics and inheritance to sow confusion and discord, although we have really grown beyond this now in the 5th post-Atlantean epoch. The Ahrimanic power employs all that originates in heredity to set groups of human beings at odds with each other. Everything based on differences of family, race, and nation is used by the Ahrimanic powers to sow discord. It is a fine thing to preach freedom for every race and nation, even the smallest, but adversarial powers always employ fine words to sow confusion and to achieve the things that Ahriman wishes to for his incarnation. Who is it who incites nation against nation and invokes the kinds of issues that dominate humanity today? It is Ahriman, the Ahrimanic seduction influencing people. People are so easily deceived in this domain. They do not wish to descend to the deeper strata where realities exist. Ahriman is ably preparing for his aims. Since the Reformation and Renaissance, the prevailing view of the human being in modern culture has been that of, in quotes, economic man. And rulers have been those with economic power. You can trace this clearly in history. If you go further back in history to ancient times, even to the era I spoke of as Luciferic in character, the rulers were initiates. The Egyptian pharaohs, the Babylonian rulers, the rulers of Asia were initiates. Then the era of priests emerged, of priest kings, and they were dominant, basically, until the Reformation and Renaissance. Since then, economic man holds sway, and rulers are only the agents of economic factors. We must not think that modern rulers are anything other than the agents of economic man. And all the laws that have been created, it is worth studying this carefully, are simply a consequence of what economists have thought. Not until the 19th century do we see banking ideas and bankers replacing economic factors, and only then is the whole social order created, which overlays and hides all other social conditions by means, really, of the money economy. It is just a question of seeing these things clearly and tracing them in an empirical, phenomenological way. Everything I said in my second public lecture here is profoundly true. We should study all the details of these things, and if we do so, we'll discover them to be thoroughly true. Specifically, as the dominance of a mere, quote, symbol for genuine goods, close quote, emerged, a major Ahrimanic deception surfaced with it. If we do not understand that we must counter economic man and the economic order established by bankers with the legislative state and the spiritual organism of society, Ahriman will once again find in this failure of perception a substantial means to prepare the triumph of his incarnation, which is certainly underway and will arrive. These are the kinds of means Ahriman can use, drawing on a certain type of person. However, there is also another type, though often both types are present in one and the same person, who helps to smooth his triumphant progress. You see, complete errors in real life are not actually as harmful as half and quarter truths. Things completely mistaken soon become apparent, while half and quarter truths seduce people. They live with them, and these partial truths worm their way into life and have the most devastating effects. There are people who do not recognize that the worldview of Galileo and Copernicus are partial truths, do not perceive their illusory nature, or find it too arduous to engage with them at all. We have shown already how misguided this is. But there are also people today, a great many of them, who acknowledge a certain half-truth, a very important one, and refuse to recognize that it is only true within certain limits. Just as it is partial and one-sided to acknowledge the world only as Galileo and Copernicus describe it, or more generally, in terms of academic disciplines of a materialistic kind, so it is likewise one-sided to acknowledge the world only as it is presented in the Gospels, and to refuse any other approach to truth and reality. The Gospels were, of course, given to those who lived in the first centuries of Christianity. To believe today that the Gospels can give us the whole of Christianity is a half-truth, and therefore one that continually befuddles people, offering Ahriman the best means to achieve the goal, the triumphant conquest of his incarnation. There are a great many people nowadays who believe they are speaking in Christian humility when they say that they have no need of spiritual science. In fact, this is terrible arrogance. The simplicity and plain speaking of the Gospels, they say, leads them to the eternal truths humankind needs. It is usually actually real arrogance that comes to expression in such seeming humility, and this proves very useful to Ahriman in the way I have suggested. Please do not forget what I said at the start of today's reflections, that at the time when the Gospels were written, people's thinking, feeling, and vision, their whole way of seeing things, was imbued with a Luciferic quality. They were able to grasp the Gospels in terms of a kind of Luciferic gnosis. But nowadays, we can no longer grasp the Gospels in this ancient way. To hammer on about the Gospels as they have been handed down to us will no longer give us a real comprehension of Christ. A true view of Christ is in fact nowhere less forthcoming than in the diverse religious confessions. For us to come to a real understanding of Christ today, the Gospels need to be deepened through spiritual science. Here, it is interesting to study the separate Gospels carefully and fathom their true content. But just to take the Gospels at face value, as many people are nowadays taught to do, is not a path toward Christ, but a path away from Him. This is why the confessions are drifting ever further away from Christ. What view of Christ is found by someone who takes the Gospels at face value without deepening them through spiritual science? If he does really study the Gospels, he will ultimately arrive at a form of Christ, but one that falls far short of the reality to which only spiritual science can lead us. The Gospels as they are lead to a correct view of Christ in a sense, yet this is only a kind of hallucination, a picture or vision if you like, albeit a real inner one, but no more than a picture. We do not find Christ's reality by this means. And this is precisely the reason why modern theology has become so materialistic. Those who study the Gospels merely as theology arrive at the view that what can be gained from them is more or less the same as the conclusion they draw from Paul's Damascene experience. Wishing to establish Christianity, yet in fact undermining it, they state that Paul was sick, mentally ill, and this was why he had his vision at Damascus. The Gospels alone only enable us to form an hallucination, a vision. Through them we can gain an inwardly true picture, but not the reality of Christ. To reach the real Christ, we have to fathom everything that we can today gain from spirit knowledge of the world. This is why those who reject any kind of true spiritual knowledge and perception, and in their sectarian confessions hammer on the truth of the Gospels alone, are already forming the beginnings of a flock for Ahriman, when he appears in human form within modern civilization. They reject all spiritual exertions that lead to detailed and tangible perception, and their circles will therefore produce hosts of adherents to Ahriman's cause. These things are developing and are at work amongst modern humanity. Someone who speaks to humankind today, whether of social questions or other matters, with knowledge of initiation science, is speaking in this context and addressing this situation. He knows where the adversarial powers are at work, that they dwell above all in the supersensible realm, and that human beings, poor souls, are succumbing to them, are being led astray. His appeal to humanity will therefore be this: let us try to free ourselves from the grave temptations that seek to enlist us in establishing and consolidating the triumph of Ahriman. There are many who feel something along these lines, but there is not yet enough courage to fully engage, as anthroposophic spiritual science must, with Christ and the historical impulses of Lucifer and Ahriman in the thorough way that is needed. People sense the need for this, but they hold back from going far enough. Where today can we find recognition of the need to penetrate worldly, materialistic science and its Ahrimanic character with the Christ impulse? And on the other hand, to illumine the Gospels through spiritual scientific insights. How many people are really working to do both the one and the other through true spiritual scientific endeavors? Yet humanity will only gain the right stance toward Ahriman's earthly incarnation by comprehending these things. At the same time, finding the courage, will, and energy to shine the Spirit into worldly science and to illumine the Gospels with this same Spirit. Otherwise, only half-truths will emerge. Think, for instance, of an enlightened figure such as Cardinal Neumann, who had clear vision of modern religious developments. When he was invested as cardinal in Rome, he openly stated in his address that to survive into the future, Christian Catholic teachings would need a new revelation. But we do not need a new revelation, for the age of revelations in the old sense has passed. Instead, we need a new science that is illumined by the Spirit. But people need the courage to engage with this new science. Think, for instance, of a literary series such as titled Lux Mundi, around the end of the 1880s, the beginning of the 1890s. Certain members of the English High Church, renowned theologians that belonged to it, sought to build bridges between worldly disciplines and religious dogma. But this amounted only to a tentative, tenuous effort rather than a keen grasp of worldly science, a real illumining of it by the Spirit, an open-minded study of the Gospels. Nowhere was it clearly stated that the Gospels alone are no longer enough, that they need illumining and clarifying. But that is what modern humanity needs, a two-pronged courage that says worldly science alone leads to illusion and the Gospels alone lead to hallucination. We will only find a middle way between illusion and hallucination in a real spiritually informed grasp of reality. That is what counts. It is important to penetrate these things with understanding. A merely worldly science would sow nothing but illusion amongst humanity, and would lead people eventually to accomplish nothing but idiocies. There is already enough stupidity in the world. Yes, we have to shed a good deal of our subjective inclinations, a good deal of what we feel naturally drawn to, which we consider to be pious or clever. Of primary importance today is for us to develop an all-round sense of the truth, and for this, courage is required. That is what I wished to say to you today, so that you can realize that what we are trying to achieve within humanity does not have much deeper roots than merely subjective inclinations or prejudice. It is read from the signs of the times as something that must be undertaken. It has been a relatively long time since we met together here, and I was very concerned today to say what I now have. I hope that we will have a further opportunity to speak about such things again in the not-too-distant future. But their automatic minds may bring up all kinds of echoes from the past. It is interesting that such things happen every now and again. In 1912, a science called eugenics was established in London. People tend to use highfalutin names for anything which is particularly stupid. The ideas you find in eugenics really came from people's brains and not from their souls. What are the aims of this science? To ensure that only healthy individuals are born in future and not inferior ones. Economics and anthropology are to join forces to discover the laws according to which men and women are to be brought together in such a way that a strong race is produced. People are really beginning to think in this way. The ideal of the London Congress, which was chaired by Darwin's son, was to examine people of different classes to see how large the skulls of the rich were compared to those of the poor, who have less opportunity for learning, how far sensibility went in rich and poor, how far the rich could resist getting tired, and how far the poor would do so, and so on. They want to gain information on the human body in this way, which may at some future date enable them to establish exactly the following. This is how the man should look. This is how the woman should look if they are to produce the true human being of the future. He should have such a capacity for getting tired, and she such a capacity. This size skull for him, and a matching size for her, and so on. Those are the rumblings, natural rumblings, in brains which are emptied of soul. Ideas rumbling about which had reality in the Atlantean age. Then there really were laws which enabled people to determine size, growth, and all kinds of things by crossbreeding and the like. It was a science that was widespread in Atlantean times, and as I mentioned yesterday, sorely misused. Atlantean science worked on the basis of physical relationships, and it was known that if such a man was brought together with such a woman, differences between men and women were much greater at the time, the result would be such and such a creature, and then a different variety could be produced, just as plant breeders do today. The mysteries brought order into this crossbreeding, where related and different elements were brought together. They established groups and withdrew anything which had to be withdrawn from humanity. The blackest of black magic was practiced in Atlantean times, and order was created by establishing classes and taking these matters out of human control. This was one of the factors which led to the nations and races of today. The issue of the nation as an entity is coming up again in our present time. It is an echo of the soulless brain from Atlantean times. There is so much talk about national issues today, but it is only the body speaking. The spirit has withdrawn and already belongs to a totally different world today. There you have the discrepancy between the reality and the speechifying about the principle of nationality, in quotes, which goes on today. This will never lead to anything good. If politics are based on issues relating to nations, which are no longer issues of the day because the soul belongs to entirely different orders and realms than those which come to expression in our physical nature, this will inevitably take us into chaos over and over again. All this must be known, and it can only be known through anthroposophy. Those rumblings in the brain emptied of soul are the reason why ideas that human beings should be produced on the basis of certain laws are now coming up again. Something else also reveals the rumblings of outdated ideas. Ideas which can still be active in dried up brains, but which no longer come from the soul. The soul needs to be made strong so that anthroposophy can enter into it. Then people will speak out of their individual reality again. You have no doubt heard of all the nonsense we get now, with all kinds of different people shown to be what they are in the light of psychopathology. All it needs is for someone to write a decent poem. The doctor will immediately tell you what illness he has. So we get all kinds of treatises on Victor Scheffel from the psychiatrist's point of view, on Nietzsche from the psychiatrist's point of view, and on Conrad Ferdinand Meyer from the psychiatrist's point of view. Reading between the lines, we feel the authors of these books are saying, "Pity he did not get treatment in time. If he had had treatment at the right time, someone like Conrad Ferdinand Meyer, for example, would not have written the kinds of things he has written, for they are entirely written out of a diseased state." It is very much in the spirit of our time that no attention is paid to the growing inwardness of individual human beings. Sometimes this must inevitably have the effect, especially in someone like Conrad Ferdinand Meyer, of the outward physical body showing signs of disease, so that the inner life can achieve the highest spiritual level in a work of art, quite independent of the physical body. I am not bringing these things up in order to criticize them. From the purely medical point of view, they are, of course, correct. There is nothing to be said against them. It is equally possible to do something else from a purely medical point of view. You can take the Gospels and show from a number of things that Jesus Christ, that strange individual, existed because some quite specific pathological elements had come together. Such a book has in fact been written, and anyone can read it. Another book shows that everything which came from the individual called Jesus could only have come from this individual because he was suffering from a particular disease. We must penetrate all these things with our understanding if we are to enter into present developments. I especially want to discuss the education issue in this context, to show you that today growing children cannot be considered in a way which focuses only on things which come to outward expression. If we were to do so, our efforts at education would sometimes simply fail to reach the element which is now becoming more and more inward. Such things are not properly taken into account today. And this is why there is so little understanding and so much Philistinism. In some respects, Philistinism is the opposite of a true understanding of human nature, for Philistines always like to stick to the norm. Anything which does not fit in with this is considered abnormal. But this will not help us to understand the world around us, and above all, other human beings. One of the things we should encourage in our anthroposophical society is to learn to understand human beings, so that we may give due regard to the individual nature of others. Individuals differ much more from each other than one thinks, for the human soul no longer relates entirely to the body, and this makes human beings very complex today. This, of course, has other consequences, though the matter is dealt with rather clumsily today. We must hope that anthroposophy will help people become less clumsy about it. Just consider, in ancient Greece, the whole body was filled with the whole soul, and they were in agreement. Today, this is not the case, for the bodies are partly empty. I'm not saying anything derogatory about empty heads. They will stay empty as part of evolution. In reality, however, nothing stays empty in this world. The heads are merely empty of something which was destined to fill them at another time. Nothing is ever completely empty. With the human soul withdrawing more and more from the body is increasingly in danger of being filled with something else. And if human beings are not prepared to take up impulses which can only come from spiritual knowledge, the body will be filled with demonic powers. Humanity is facing a destiny where the body may be filled with Ahrimanic demonic powers. So we have to add to what I said yesterday about future development. There will be people in future who are, Tom, Dick, and Harry in ordinary life, which is something determined by social circumstances. But their bodies will be empty to such an extent that a powerful Ahrimanic spirit can live in them. One will be meeting Ahrimanic demons. Human beings will not be what they appear to be. The individual person will be deep down inside, and outwardly one will get a totally different picture. This shows the complexity of life to come. It is reasonable to say that there will be situations in future when it will be difficult to know who one is dealing with. Ricarda Huch's longing for the devil really arises from what will be coming in the future. The institutions and ideas, especially the social ideas people have today, are abstract and crude. They are clumsy in the face of the complexities that are lying ahead. And because people are not able to have ideas or concepts about the true nature of things, they are sliding more and more deeply into chaos. The events of the war make this quite clear. Chaos is arising because reality has changed. Reality is becoming fuller and richer than anything people are able to think of or create in their heads. And we shall have to be clear in our minds that we are faced with a choice: to go on beating each other to a pulp, shooting at one another in the way we do now, because we do not know how to bring order into the world, or start to develop concepts and ideas to match the complexity of the situation. A spiritual movement must exist where people seek to develop concepts which meet the real situation. There will be vast numbers of people in future who want to stick to the rumblings of the past. Today they are still in the minority. Their concepts, ideas, and actions will be based on the outside world around them, and on the fact that their bodies are being filled with the Ahrimanic spirit which wants them to form such ideas. We should not fool ourselves, for we are faced with a quite specific movement. At the Council of Constantinople it was decreed that the spirit did not exist. It was dogmatically stated that the human being consisted only of body and soul, and it was heresy to speak of a human spirit. In the same way, attempts will be made to decree the soul, the inner life, as non-existent. The time will come, and it may not be far off, when quite different tendencies will come up at a congress like the one held in 1912, and people will say, it is pathological for people to even think in terms of spirit and soul. Sound, in quotes, people will speak of nothing but the body. It will be considered a sign of illness for anyone to arrive at the idea of any such thing as a spirit or a soul. People who think like that will be considered to be sick, and, you can be quite sure of it, a medicine will be found for this. At Constantinople, the spirit was made non-existent. The soul will be made non-existent with the aid of a drug. Taking a, quote, sound point of view, close quote, people will invent a vaccine to influence the organism as early as possible, preferably as soon as it is born, so that this human body never even gets the idea that there is a soul and a spirit. The two philosophies of life will be in complete opposition. One movement will need to reflect how concepts and ideas may be developed to meet the reality of soul and spirit. The others, the heirs of modern materialism, will look for the vaccine to make the body, in quotes, healthy. That is, makes its constitution such that this body no longer talks of such rubbish as soul and spirit, but takes a sound view of the forces which live in engines and in chemistry, and that planets and suns arise from nebula in the cosmos. Materialistic physicians will be asked to drive the souls out of humanity. People who think that playful ideas will help them to look ahead to the future are very much mistaken. We need serious, profound ideas to look ahead to the future. Anthroposophy is not a game, not just a theory. It is a task that must be faced for the sake of human evolution. The end of Lecture 5. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Fall of the Spirits of Darkness. This is Lecture 6, entitled The New Spirituality, given in Dornach on the 8th of October, 1917.